Well, thanks for joining, everybody. Today, I'll be talking about storytelling in business. Storytelling is a very powerful way of communicating. It's not the only way of communicating, but storytelling in business is being used a lot more. It's been done for ages and ages, but it's now sort of become an accepted thing. And if you tell people that, you're kind of telling a story in business, they don't raise their eyebrows so much anymore. The thing is that business is all about people to people, and everybody has a story. Every single one of us has a story, and every one of us is a storyteller. And the people that you're doing business with, whoever they are, every one of them has got a story. And our challenge in business really is to understand our customers. And that is really the secret, I think, of communicating with people, is to understand our audience. And once we understand them, we get to know them, then we begin finding out what their stories are. And we're able to tell our stories to them about our business and the way our business came about and our products and our services in many different ways. And the thing that is different about storytelling that does not exist really in other forms of business communication is that stories tend to get our attention. And that is probably the most valuable thing in these days, especially we try so hard. The percentage value of you getting heard on the internet these days, whether it's in social media or with your blog or people visiting your website, it's a very tiny percentage of attention that we can get in just ordinary ways. And one of the ways to improve that is by telling stories. And there's something in storytelling called narrative transportation. And what that is when people begin to hear a story, what they do is they leave the world that they're in and they travel over to the world of the story. And as they're listening to the story, you've now got them in that world where the story exists. And you know that's true because if you've got kids and you tell kids a story, say a bedtime story or whatever, they travel into that world and they want to hear more. When it's finished, they say, oh, can I hear more? And it's the same with a movie or a novel, anything like that. We travel into that world. So narrative transportation is one of the powerful features of storytelling. And it's how we keep the attention of our listeners, because we've got them now into a certain world and they'll stay there with us. Another thing about storytelling is we care about the character in the story. Now, if you think of movies, all of this will apply to business. But if you think, say, of a movie that you really enjoyed, the movie's begun, you've met the main character, you care about them, and so you continue watching the movie because you want to know what happens to them. They've got your curiosity, and you're emotionally engaged with them now. And the people that we're dealing with are people that are just like us. Any one of these people in this picture here could be us. We could have been there, and we probably have been in those situations. And just anywhere that we are, the people who are next to us, they're people just like us. And therefore, they react to stories in the same way that we do. And so there's a big audience out there. And once you find the particular people that really are your audience for your business, then we zero in on them and they become, our sort of trusted audience, people that will listen to us and follow us. Another powerful thing about stories is that we remember them. And there's this word in marketing called sticky, and stories stick. We remember a story long after we remember facts and figures and statistics and so on. We remember a story, and that's another powerful feature of stories. Now, I guess if there's one thing that is that the core of every single story, whether it's fiction or it's in your business, and that is this idea of conflict and desire. And the reason for that is that we all have a problem. Okay, you are in business to solve somebody else's problem. We go searching the internet because we have a problem and we're looking for somebody to solve our problem. Now there's our conflict. And if you think of a movie that you really enjoy, we meet the character, all of a sudden the character comes upon a problem or a conflict, and the movie is all about the journey that they take to solve that problem. Okay, now the desire is, if the character in the movie doesn't have a strong enough desire to solve that problem, it's not going to be a very good movie. It's the same thing in our business. Our particular audience, the people who would be our really most valuable customers, have a desire to solve their problem. When we meet them, the desire may not be as strong as we want it to be. And so that's the purpose of things like blogs and newsletters and just getting in touch and keeping, just like what Paul is doing with all of these webinars and everything. Paul is strengthening our desire to know more from the people within the networking group. Say, Charles is a photographer, and just for argument's sake, if Charles specialized in, say, family photographs, then it's, a lot of people might look at his site and think, okay, Charles does lovely photographs, and they may look at many others. But if Charles was in touch with them more and more and kept communication going with them, their desire to solve their problem, like wanting great family photos, would increase, with Charles. Their desire toward having Charles come and take their photos would increase, as opposed to the other ones who just aren't in touch with them. And that's the purpose of communication in business and marketing, is to keep in touch with them. So what I'm going to do now very briefly is just go through all of the elements of a story. And we can apply this to business. Now, every story has a journey through that story, and that's called a plot. The plot is a pathway through the story. And if you go and you look at a movie tonight, say it's an hour and a half, for that whole hour and a half, you're going to be taken on a journey. And at the end of it, the journey will finish and the problem will be solved and there'll be some sort of a lesson learned, as we'll see. But what will have taken us through that movie, through that hour and a half, is a pathway, different things that happen. So the very beginning of every story, and this also applies to, say, if you're writing a blog or a newsletter, whatever you're doing, is the first thing you've got to do is have a hook, okay? If you've put a little post out on Facebook, the first phrase or the first sentence should be something that draws them in and makes them think, well, I've got to read a bit more now. If you don't have a hook at the beginning, then you've lost them. In a video, when I produce videos, I just make sure within the first 5 seconds maximum, there is something that makes the viewer think, well, I've got to look at more, I've got to see more. And so the hook is vitally important to keep them there. If not, they're gone. Because there's so many other options. So you really have got to hook them in somehow. If you start with backstory and all of these various things, and it's like 2 paragraphs before you get to your main point or your hook, they're gone. They're gone within 3 sentences, So the hook is very important to keep them in. And then what happens is a conflict arises. So after you've hooked them in, you introduce the conflict and you say, right, here's what the problem is. And so now their curiosity comes. Naturally, we're born with this, okay? There is a science in storytelling. It does happen within the brain and within the body. There's adrenaline that rises when conflict comes. There are different chemicals released within the brain. It's a very scientific thing. But when we see a conflict, certain things happen within us and we want to know more. And then when the conflict arises, there will be some incident or the other, that all of a sudden launches the story and the journey begins. If I think of a very famous movie, like for instance, maybe Star Wars. Okay, so Luke is a farm boy. I believe it's in Nebraska or somewhere. He's a farm boy, and he hears about, you know, the evil people and so on, but he's not interested. He's got his aunt and his uncle there, and, you know, he says, this is my life here, and so on. And then the bad people come along and they kill his aunt and his uncle. Now that is the inciting incident in that movie, because Luke says, okay, now I've got to come and I've got to kill these bad guys. They kill my aunt and uncle. That's the inciting incident. Something always happens. And if you look out for this, it's called story finding. Okay, if you look out for this in the next book that you read or the next movie that you look at, okay, the hook will bring you in. You'll see some problem arising, then something will happen that launches a story, and that's the inciting incident. Then the journey begins. You know, then we're taken through the plot. The journey begins, you know, and there are probably 6 or 7 milestones throughout the journey as the movie continues, and, you know, it keeps going. And then toward the end, the journey gets harder and harder, and you think, oh my God, is the hero going to fail? You know, is he going to succeed? It just seems like overwhelming. And then all of a sudden, success, and there's resolution. And we realize that the hero of the story has overcome the problem, and the bad guys have been banished, or whatever happens. And at the end of the story, it's not a story until at the very end something has changed and there's a lesson to be learned. And so that is the journey through every single story that you'll ever come across. And we have to apply this to business. Obviously, we can't approach everything in business like a movie, but we can use the elements of a story in our business when we are communicating with people. You know, the first thing you remember is, look, I've got to get their attention. I've got to hook them in. I've got to empathize with their problem. I understand what your problem is. And, you know, the people think, well, okay, he knows what my problem is, you know, and then all of a sudden, you've got their attention. You tell them what you have to tell them, and you show that you understand their problem. And at the end of it, you show that you've learned a lesson from whatever it is. If it's a blog post about a particular topic, at the end of that post, you've got to have shown that there's a lesson in all of this. So in every story, there is a lesson. What I would encourage you to do is a very, very good documentary called The New Hustle. And I really would recommend that everybody looks at The New Hustle. The New Hustle is about 3 founders who wanted to solve a problem. And it's, I'll go back one slide, because it's thenewhustlemovie.com, or you can just go onto YouTube and you can just type in The New Hustle and it'll come up on YouTube, or you can go to thenewhustlemovie.com. But, sorry, going forward now, it's about 3 founders who wanted to solve a problem. The first one, there was Andre and Justin, and they really, their problem was that wine was a very elitist thing in Australia. Okay, it was the big wine companies that controlled everything. They wanted to democratize wine. They wanted wine to be for people. Okay, so that was their big journey. They wanted to have a showroom where people could come in, they could do tastings, they could deliver to people's houses, and it wasn't controlled by the big companies. There was Luke. Luke was basically, you can see it in the movie, but to cut a story short, he was fresh out of college, didn't know what to do. He took a job as a private investigator, and his job was to follow people that got hurt at work to see if they were really actually hurt at work, or if they were just, like, you know, scamming. And there was this one guy he followed who had a back injury at work, and he was following him, you know, and the guy took the company to court, and his wife left him. It took a long process. Eventually the guy got the money, but the guy's wife wouldn't come back home. She said, no, you know, we're through. And the guy committed suicide. And Luke was following this guy, and he realized, hang on a second, I'm part of the problem. You know, I'm not doing anything about these people who get hurt at work. So he decided he wanted to start a company that helped people to be safe at work. And that was his inciting incident. When the person he was following committed suicide, he said, no, I can't be a part of the problem anymore. I want to be part of the solution. So he started a company called Safety Culture, and he developed an app. And in the movie, you'll see him go through the whole thing. And there's also Mel and Cliff, who started Canva. Mel was really the one, I'm sure everybody knows Canva, but Mel thought, you know, she grew up designing and stuff. And her thing was that software should not be a problem, okay? People should not have to learn software. Software should learn people. And that was her thing. She wanted to start a design company that turned the tables completely to where the software would learn the person. And that was her journey. And in the movie, you'll see, you know, the movie begins, you kind of want to watch more, then you see what the problem is, and then you see each of them begin their journey. You see the journey, you see the resolution, and then at the end, you know, you see what the what happens. Okay, so story is not the only tool in the marketing toolbox, okay, but it's only one with a strong emotional connection. And we all know this to be true. Emotions, people don't buy from facts and figures. People buy because they got a feeling of some kind, okay? The major part of a buying decision comes from a feeling that people have. They just feel that they like you. They just feel that you'll do the best job for them. Now that's emotion, okay? How do we build that emotion? Well, story is a very powerful way to build that emotion, but it's not the only tool in the marketing toolbox. Some of the other tools in the marketing toolbox, and as a copywriter, I've used all of these, okay? There's information, there are brochures, there is education, training, workshops, webinars. None of these are stories. There's news and announcements, and there's direct sales, you know, buy now, special offer, you know, 2 days left, sign up now, or the best chance in the world be gone. There's freemium, you know, come in, this is free, take a free thing. And all of a sudden, the next step you want to take is a paid step. All of these are tools in the marketing toolbox. So story is not the only tool, but it's the most powerful tool. And there are stories in business. You know, we need to learn to tell stories in business, but what kinds of stories are there in business? Well, there's the founder story. If you started your own business, there's your story. What did you go through to start your business? What has your journey been? What problems have you had? How have you overcome those? Has your desires obviously been strong enough to overcome all of the conflicts that you face? Okay, so there's your story as the owner or the founder. There are stories about the growth of your business, the failures, the successes. If you have employees, your employees have stories, and those could very easily be told because they're part of the company. You know, they're part of the brand, and their stories are just as valuable as yours. There are customer stories naturally, and those are very powerful stories. But if you can find a customer who is willing to share their story about their journey with you, I mean, that's that's called a case study. And the customer actually tells the story. It's a bit more than a testimonial. A testimonial is a few lines, maybe you put on your website or, you know, your brochure or whatever, where the customer says, oh, I really love dealing, you know, with this business. But a case study is a bit different. That's where the customer tells their story about dealing with you and their impression of dealing with you. And that is a very valid story. And in that story, you can bring in the conflict. You can bring in what made the customer actually get in touch, that inciting incident. You can bring in the journey that they had with you. And then you can show how it all worked out and what lesson as a customer learned at the end. You know, you don't finish a case study without some kind of a lesson at the end that the viewer can take away with them, because they're probably going to remember the very end more than they remember anything else. So we have to learn to tell stories and to find stories. There is a skill in finding stories. It's called story finding, and it's just something we learn to do. There's a great quote from a guy called Patrick Moreau, who started Muse Storytelling. And it's, if you're not telling great stories, you're likely to be overlooked and forgotten. Now look at that. all of these people, all of those flats, you know, look at that. I mean, where are we going to stand out in all of that? We're going to stand out if we tell stories and we connect emotionally with people, you know. So that is storytelling in business, and why I believe storytelling is a very powerful tool in the marketing toolbox.
Thank you very much, Robin. I'll just unshare your screen. So if anybody's got any questions or comments for Robin, the floor is now yours. For me, Robin, have you got any examples of clients you've worked with where you've looked at their business and taken them on this process to have them be in a much more, I don't know, powerful place or better position, given the story that you've helped create for them?
Absolutely. All through my career, I've been in market. I've been copywriting and producing videos and films for 38 years now. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and I was writing video scripts for a production company there, and I was headhunted by the Benton and Bowles agency. Benton and Bowles used to be a very large global advertising agency out of the UK. I worked for Benton and Bowles, I worked for Saatchi and Saatchi, I worked for Footcone and Belding. But I was headhunted as a young scriptwriter and brought into this advertising agency. And the first project that I had was for a bank. And the bank was called the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. And they were bringing one of the very first cash machines into Trinidad. You know, the hole in the wall, the ATM. Previous to this, okay, everybody had to go and line up in the bank, and it could take you half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, depends what time of day you went, to go through the line, to get to the teller, to say, can I have some cash, please? Okay, so the bank of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce was bringing in one of the very first cash machines. Now this was a big thing, and their selling point was it would take less than a minute for you to get your cash, as opposed to standing in line for an hour, right? That was their selling point. So I didn't know anything about storytelling. I've always been a storyteller. So the first thing that came to my mind was this amazing story, okay? Now in Trinidad, where the culture is maybe a bit different, they were really into their Westerns, you know, and in the Westerns, you see these two guys come out for a shootout in the middle of the street, everybody disappears. You got the bad guy, you got the good guy, and they look each other in the eye, and then they have a shootout, okay? Now that's a typical Western scene. And I knew that was like really popular in Trinidad. And it was the audience that they were aiming at. It was a man in the street. So I came up with this ad where this guy would pull up in a car, which is fairly near to the cash machine, but it's in a spot where you're not allowed to park, okay? And in the distance was a big security guard. And there was quite a bit of humor, because the guy that pulled up in the car, I chose this guy who was an actor, Errol Fabian, and he was very funny. His face was funny. So he's, you know, just looking at him, his expressions. Anyway, he pulled up in the car, and then they had this thing, you know, in the Western where they look at each other in the eyes, and the guard looked at him, and he looked at the guard, and he looked at his watch. And then he decided that it would take the guard more than a minute. All of this is told, obviously, in pictures, okay? But it would take the guard more than a minute to walk over to his car. So he decided to go for it. So he jumped out of his car, he ran to the cash machine, he got the cash out, he ran back to his car, and just as the guard was approaching, he pulled out, okay? So that was a story, and that ad, I think, ran for nearly 10 years in Trinidad.
Wow. Before
the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce was nationalized, and it became a Republic Bank. But it was shown, obviously, not all the time, but it was shown over time. And it was very, very popular ad. And many other ads came along where I told stories. I had this company that brought out a new perfume. And the perfume was called Black Aura. Okay, so what I did was I chose a character, and the character's name was Laura. And I told they wanted a very short ad on the radio. Now radio is a bit more difficult. So I created a jingle, okay? And I told a story in the jingle. And the jingle, of course, ran for like, I don't know, it was 20 seconds or something. But it was all about Laura and how she related to Black Aura. And of course, it was very memorable. And just all through my career, I mean, I could tell you ad after ad. Some things I do, like my biggest client now is a company called Bloomberg. And I film for them. And they have events, and I film their events. How do you tell a story with an event? You know, if they've got a 2-day event, and they've got all of these top financial speakers, and they've got audiences of traders and, you know, people coming along, people in the finance industry coming along, how do you tell a story about that? Well, the way I tell a story for them is that every event has a theme, okay? And what I do is I film the whole event, but then I spend probably 2 or 3 days sitting down, and I go through and I pick out every comment that a speaker has made that relates to that theme, because every story has to have a theme, you see? And that's the way I tell it. So when I do a 2.5 to 3 minute, what they call in America, the Americans call a sizzle reel, which is a highlight reel, how do you get a 2-day event into 2.5 to 3 minutes? Well, what I do is I have the theme there, and I have all of these little bits that relate to the theme from the speakers, and you know, I show other stuff as well to make it entertaining. But I keep to the theme all the way through, and that's how I tell a story with an event. You know, because it's kind of hard, you know, to tell a traditional story, but I still use some of the principles. You know, I still pick out the principles I can use.
Makes sense, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions or comments for Robin while he's here live and dangerous?
Yeah.
Hi Robin, it's Jill here.
Hi Jill.
So I'm a speaker coach, and last week I did one of the BuzzCon talks actually on how to speak and present, particularly on video, on Zoom and all the rest of it. And of course, part of my presentation was about telling stories. So it's great, and we're singing off the same song sheet, which is fabulous. And I so admire what you do in being able to create those stories on video, because you know, that's a really very special talent. But it's really hard, isn't it? I think what I see is that, you know, in this day and age, a lot of guys are so focused on the money side of their business, or you know, it's all a bit of a struggle. But if we put it in perspective, you know, if you look at somebody like John Lewis and they do their massive Christmas adverts, you know, they don't just put their Christmas advert on with pictures of toasters and, you know, linen and crackers. You know, they tell a story, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Often the story is completely irrelevant. I mean, God knows what it was last year. It was something about I don't know, a dragon or something. But, you know, and I think this is what's so important. What you're doing here is highlighting that in order for you to stand out and get the people's attention, whatever it is that you do, you have to be able to engage them in a story. So I think you've illustrated that beautifully. And, you know, it is true that none of us really spend as much time or money on marketing as we should, because actually those huge companies are so successful because their marketing budgets are huge, and they're able to pay people like you to do these really professional marketing campaigns for them. So, you know, I'm not saying that we have to hire you, because
no. I mean, Bloomberg is one thing, but you know, I work with all kinds of people, and you know, they've got their own situations, and obviously when I work with them, you know, I've got crews and everything like that. You know, it's a lot different. I mean, but your point, like John Lewis, the reason that John Lewis is so successful with their storytelling is because they're doing what they call brand storytelling. So they're not featuring products, but they are featuring the brand John Lewis. And what they're doing is what I mentioned, they're playing to your emotions. Now, all of these people that you talk about who really are just going after the money, that's the wrong approach, because people are not going to part with their money unless they've been fooled somehow or they don't think properly. Okay, what I have found in my whole career is you go after the audience, you build a relationship with the audience, And when the audience trusts you and they really have some connection with you, it's just a no-brainer that they're gonna part with their money with you, even if your competition is huge. It doesn't matter, you know. So it really is empathizing with an audience and connecting with them emotionally. And that's what John Lewis do with their brand storytelling. You know, if they were doing a different ad during the year and they were featuring a toaster, they would feature the toaster and it would be a product story, you see. But at Christmas, they do a brand story. And we should think of ourselves as well as a brand, you know, so we can tell these sort of overarching overview type stories to connect emotionally with the viewer. And then, you know, we can tell other stories about our product and so on. Or we might have a sale and it may not be a story at all. It's just an opportunity that comes up. But if you put that in front of your audience and they know that it comes from you and they trust your brand, then they're very glad to hear about that sale. They can save a bit of money, you know.
Yeah, and even, you know, if you're a lawyer or a solicitor or a taxi driver, you may not see that this is for you, but actually it's no different, is it?
No, it's no different because say tax advisor, an accountant, a lawyer, these professionals all have their audiences. And why do we go to lawyers? Because we have a problem. And tax advisors, because we have a problem. You know, we have a problem, so we go to them. And if they can empathize with our problem, then they've connected with us somehow, you know, and then the relationship can begin.
I think it's interesting because I think about in a networking context and the 45 seconds or the 60 seconds or whatever it is you get. I think if you can encapsulate a story inside of that rather than, you know, I'm Fred and I sell this and I'm looking for, you know, sometimes when people give an example of how they've helped a client rather than just talk directly about their product or service, I think that becomes more memorable. You know, as you touched on earlier, people remember a story but don't necessarily remember a list of product features or something like that. So it's a good way.
Absolutely.
And it's a challenge to get a story in 45 seconds as well. But, you know, adverts on TV are sometimes less than 45 seconds, you know, and I appreciate it's visual, but, you know, they get their message across in less time. So, yeah, it's an interesting model or thing to think about when you're just doing your introductions at networking meetings or one-to-ones or whatever.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It is a challenge. And what I would do is I would just use an element of a story. Like, for instance, if there's a problem that you solve, you know, you can say, okay, so, you know, I have this, I sell, well, you get up and say you're a tax advisor. You can say that, you know, my customers come to me because they have this particular problem. Okay, now anybody in the room who's got a similar problem will immediately empathize with you, empathize with you. And you can use elements of a story. Like you can hook them in with, say, a little story that happened during the week of your client you dealt with. Or you can mention about the conflict and desire thing that I talked about. And Jill, I could send you the slides if you wanted as well. So, you know, if you missed the first parts of it. But that conflict and desire, you could play on that. You know, my customers have this problem, okay, but they really want to deal with it. They come to me with these things and I solve those problems. Everybody subconsciously connects with a conflict and a desire, which are the two main elements in any story, you know.
I usually cause conflict. I'm not sure whether I cause much desire.